Okay, so let's go to our next group of protists. And here you're starting to see that a lot of dinoflagellates, and here are a few of them, these long kind of T-shaped ones. My dog Sunshine is here saying hi. Hi, Sunshine. Good girl. Yeah. And then we got lots of diatoms in here as well. Let's talk about this next group of protists, the brown algae. But before we do, let's do a quick review question. So here's a dinoflagellate, here's a diatom. Which of the following is not shared between diatoms and dinoflagellates? They have a lot of things in common. They're very similar in a lot of ways, but they have some differences. So think about this. Pause your computer, read through them. This is a tough question. See if you can figure it out. Okay, so the answer here, let's go through them. And you'll notice that this is a tough question. This is good practice for when we do upcoming exams, have compare contrast. You'll notice that the language you use can sometimes change kind of the answers of things. So, are they both capable of photosynthesis? The answer is yes, they both can do photosynthesis. But if you're a diatom, that's all you've got. If you're a dinoflagellate, sometimes they're heterotrophic. So that's not the answer. They're both primarily haploid. That's the answer. One of those is generally haploid. Which one is it? Yep, it's the dinoflagellate tends to be haploid, and the diatoms tend to be primarily diploid. The way I remember this is think about their test. If you've got one test, you're haploid. If you've got two tests, you're diploid. Let's go through just to make sure the other answers aren't potentially good answers. They're both primarily asexual, but both can reproduce sexually too. Yeah, that's generally true for both. However, the trigger for sex is quite different. They're both unicellular. Absolutely. None of these are multicellular. And they're both aquatic. So aquatic means living in water. The dinoflagellates primarily saltwater, and the diatoms freshwater, saltwater, you name it, even glaciers. Okay, I'm going to pause for a second while I get my dog under control. It's that time of the day my dog's like, come on, let's go take a walk. And this day is one of those days that, nope, I got to keep recording. So we're good. You got to keep listening. So, okay, refresher on dinoflagellates and diatoms. Let's do the next group of protists. And I'm going to tell you that in a few minutes you're going to hate me. Like seriously hate me. And I'll take it. I can handle it. I go to bed fine. I'm not going to worry about it. But the life cycle of the seaweeds tends to be pretty weird. And you thought the dinoflagellates and diatoms were weird. You've seen nothing yet. Okay, so we'll do the seaweeds in a second. But let's introduce this group, the brown algae. So brown algae, and again, one thing I should point out in the textbook, all of the groups of protists we're covering have fancy names, modern names, monophyletic, formal names. We're just going to use the common names, brown algae, diatoms, dinoflagellates. Trust me, the formal names are weirder. Um, we're just going to call them the brown algae. And if you look, they're not perfectly brown, but compared to things on Earth that are photosynthetic, they're browner than greener. Okay, some of these look pretty green, but it's more of like a brownish green rather than a green green. Hence the brown algae. And a reminder that when we say seaweeds here, we mean multicellular photosynthetic protists. So the brown algae are marine. They can live close, well, they actually don't live close to freshwater. They can't survive in freshwater. They are exclusively saltwater, marine, oceanic. Marine means oceanic. They're all photosynthetic, so all autotrophs, no heterotrophs here. And most of them, not all of them, but most attached to a substrate. Substrate means like the floor you're on, the seafloor, and most of these need rocks. So if it's muddy or sandy, you're not going to see these that often. They tend to require a hard substrate, a rock or a boulder, maybe a thick, big shell in order to attach. Because of this being attached to things, photosynthetic, and multicellular, they're very, very plant-like, but they are not plants. They're kind of like the trees or the plants of the ocean, but they're not plants. In fact, in this case, they're not anywhere closely related to plants. Now, the thing I want you to keep in mind when we talk about seaweeds, these macroalgae, these seaweeds, is not only are they multicellular, but in the evolution of life, these eukaryotes you can think of as kind of experiments in multicellularity. Okay, animals, plants, and most fungi are famous for being multicellular. The seaweeds are kind of a eukaryotic first kind of experimentation evolutionarily with being multicellular. Um, and so if you think of our structural hierarchy, cells, then we've got tissues and organ systems. And the organism, they kind of go from cells right to the organism, and they kind of flirt with having an organ, but they don't have a true organ. Why? Because they don't have true tissues. Remember, a tissue is a group of cells that work together for a particular function. The cells of seaweed, even if the parts of the body all look very distinct, the cells are fundamentally the same kind of cell. And so they're not groups of specialized cells working together. They're simply one kind of cell that's put together in different ways to function as an organism. And so they're usually called organs, but it's not a true organ because there's not true tissue. So we'll call it organ-like. And depending on the kind of seaweed, there's different kinds of organ-like structures. If you are what's called a kelp, which is kind of the tree of the seaweed world, that makes up a special habitat called a kelp forest. It's basically a bunch of these seaweeds. This is one organism. Basically, it's like a tree. They have an attachment structure at the bottom called a holdfast. It's kind of like the roots of a tree. It's where they attach to a rock. They've got a stalk, which helps them kind of grow tall and vertical toward the sunlight and hold themselves structurally above the seafloor. And then they have leaf-like structures called blades, whose job is like a leaf to capture sunlight, to do photosynthesis. But they've got chloroplasts everywhere. It's not like a tree where you've got a stalk that's woody and a root that's below ground and leaves that are green. Here, everything's the same color. It's basically fundamentally the same kind of cell. This group of seaweeds, brown algae, is a special genus called Sargassum. Sargassum is a floating brown algae, so it's not attached to the seafloor, which is weird. Most seaweeds are. But this one floats, and it floats typically in the middle of the ocean in what's called the Sargassum Sea, especially in the North Atlantic Ocean, in the middle of the ocean. It's an area with a lot of seaweed. If you've seen Finding Nemo, there's a scene where they're swimming through kind of a sargassum environment. It's a really important habitat if you're a baby fish who spends most of your adult life in the ocean, because here you can be away from predators. It's kind of like a floating island of seaweed, a raft of seaweed, really important for baby fish and baby animals like this baby sea turtle here. The kelp forest habitat's also really critically important for a similar reason. It's a kind of a nursery for baby things where they can be protected from the sharks and the big predators of the ocean. If you're sargassum, the names of the organ-like structures tend to be blades if you're leaf-like, and then they have these little bubbles of air called air bladders or floats. These are filled with, can you guess what gas? Well, if you're photosynthetic, what's a waste gas you produce? If you said carbon dioxide, you're wrong. If you're an animal who does respiration, you produce carbon dioxide. But in this case here, they've got waste oxygen. So they store the oxygen in these air bladders or these floats, and it's like a hot air balloon. It makes it buoyant and it helps this organism float so it doesn't sink. If you cut off these floats or air bladders, the seaweed will sink to the bottom of the ocean. It's photosynthetic, it will starve, and it will die. So it's a really cool adaptation. So think of these as experiments in being multicellular, complicated organisms with organs and organ systems, but because they don't have tissues, they don't have real organs. So here's kind of a dissection of the anatomy of a typical seaweed. This is a baby kelp. It has the holdfast where it glues itself to the seafloor. It has a stalk that's kind of like the trunk of a tree. Its job is to get it off the seafloor and grow as quickly as possible towards sunlight. They might have floats to help them float the upper part so they don't sink, but the stalk's job is really to lift it off the seafloor, give it enough structural support so that it doesn't sink. And then there's leaf-like structures called blades. Unlike leaves or stems or trunks of trees, there's no clear distinction. It's basically the same kind of cell in all of these parts. A stalk cell could become a blade cell. There's no differentiation of specialized cells here. It's just one kind of cell fundamentally that basically produces organ-like structures. Pretty cool. This is a kelp. Really cool. A kelp organism can be 200, 300 feet tall. Typically, they're only 25 to 100 feet tall, but this is basically as big as most bushes and trees just living underwater. So this habitat called a kelp forest really is like an underground forest, but in this case of seaweeds, really gigantic seaweeds, bigger than some of the buildings on campus.